Somewhere in West Africa, around the year 1750, a person woke up with a name. That name carried their father's lineage, their village, their place in the world. It told anyone who heard it exactly who they were, where they came from, and who their people were. It was not just a word. It was an identity, centuries deep, woven into language, into family, into the very soil of home. Within weeks, that name would be gone forever. They would be given a new one, something simple, something English or French or Spanish, something that erased in a single syllable every generation that had come before. And that erasure, that moment when a person's entire existence was reduced to a name on a ledger, a price at an auction, a number in a system, was not an accident. It was the first and most deliberate act of the most sophisticated machinery of human exploitation the modern world had ever built. This is not a story about statistics. Between 1500 and 1900, approximately 12.5 million human beings were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. We know the number. What we have forgotten, what we need to remember, is the life, the single, specific, irreducible human life, the day that began before sunrise, the night that ended with exhausted prayer, the small and extraordinary acts of defiance that kept the soul alive when everything around it was designed to destroy it. This is that story. The ships that crossed the Atlantic were called slavers. What happened inside them, the Middle Passage, was a calculated brutality so total that historians still struggle to describe it without their language failing them. Enslaved people were chained in spaces too small to sit upright, for voyages that lasted between 6 and 12 weeks. Mortality rates on some ships reached 30%. Those who survived arrived at port in a state of physical and psychological devastation that their captors had specifically engineered. Because a person who has been broken by the crossing is easier to sell, the auction block was the first act of the New World. A physician, employed by the traders, moved through the crowd of terrified, disoriented people and inspected them with the detachment of a livestock appraiser. Teeth were examined, muscles were assessed, ages were estimated. Women were assessed for reproductive potential. Men were assessed for physical labor capacity. The language used in the records of these inspections, preserved in plantation ledgers, court documents, and newspaper advertisements that historians have studied extensively, is the language of commerce, not of humanity. There is no person in these documents. There is only merchandise. And then the gavel fell, and a name, the name from the village, the name from the lineage, the name that was the person, was replaced with whatever the buyer chose to write in his ledger. Thomas, Mary, Caesar, Sam, names chosen for convenience, for irony, for the simple assertion of ownership. Names that had nothing to do with who this person was, and everything to do with who now claimed to own them. It was not bureaucracy. It was a philosophical statement. You are no longer who you were. You are what I say you are. You begin here, with me, with nothing. That was the system's first move, and it was the most important one. The plantation was not a farm. This distinction matters more than it might seem. A farm produces food. A plantation produced commodities, sugar, cotton, tobacco, rice, at industrial scale, for global markets, using human beings as the machinery. The economics of the plantation system were sophisticated, internationally connected, and ruthlessly efficient. The ships that brought enslaved people to the Americas carried cotton and sugar back to Europe. The banks that financed the slave trade also financed the textile mills that processed the cotton. The insurance companies that insured the ships also insured the enslaved people aboard them as cargo. It was not a regional aberration. It was the foundation of the early global economy, and it ran on a clock. Before sunrise, typically between 4 and 5 in the morning, a bell rang, or a horn sounded, and the workday began. It did not end until after dark. On sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Louisiana, the harvest season, called crop time, meant 18 to 20-hour days, 7 days a week for months. The sugar cane had to be cut within a specific window after ripening, or it would ferment in the field. The schedule was not set by human need. It was set by the chemistry of sugar. The work itself was dangerous in ways that are difficult to fully communicate. Sugarcane leaves are razor-edged. They cut exposed skin with every movement. The cane had to be processed immediately after cutting, which meant the boiling houses ran day and night. The vats of boiling molasses, some large enough to kill a person instantly if they fell in, never stopped. Burn injuries were common. Exhaustion injuries were common. People worked through injuries that would have halted any other kind of labor, because stopping was not an option the system permitted. Cotton required a different kind of endurance. Enslaved people on cotton plantations in the American South were assigned daily picking quotas, weight-based targets that increased incrementally, so that each person's personal best became the new baseline expectation. Historian Edward Baptist's research has documented how the systematic use of violence, the threat and reality of the whip, was used not as punishment, but as a productivity tool, a mechanism for extracting labor beyond what the human body would willingly produce. The bags dragged behind the pickers by the end of a day in the fields could weigh over 100 pounds. The weight was measured at the end of every day. If you came up short, you were beaten. If you exceeded your quota was raised. This was the machine. Human beings running it. The plantation house was always on the highest ground. This was not aesthetics. It was surveillance. From the elevated porch of the great house, white columned, gleaming, carefully maintained, the overseer or the planter could see the fields below. The entire spatial organization of the plantation was designed around visibility. The quarters where enslaved people lived were positioned to be observable. The fields were cleared to be observable. Movement that couldn't be seen was movement that couldn't be controlled. The overseer was the system's daily instrument, typically a poor white man hired for his willingness to use violence. He occupied a peculiar position, wielding enormous power over the enslaved people below him, while being himself an employee, dependent on the planter above him. Historical records document the overseer's role with clinical precision. He enforced the quotas, administered punishment, maintained the schedule, and reported to the planter. He was the middle manager of a system of terror. The contrast between the great house and the quarters was not incidental. It was the system's argument made architectural. The white columns of the mansion, the manicured gardens, the china and silver and candlelight visible through the windows, all of it built, maintained, cooked, and served by people who returned each night to one-room cabins with dirt floors and no windows. The beauty of the house was inseparable from the brutality that produced it. That was the point. The beauty was the argument for the system's naturalness, its rightness, its permanence. And then the sun went down in the slave quarters. In the space the system had left them, the hours the system could not fully claim. Something happened that the planters never fully understood and could never fully control. A culture was being built when biological families were sold apart, and they were sold apart routinely, with a casualness that historical records reveal as almost incomprehensible. New families formed. Historians call them fictive kin, the aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters, by choice rather than blood. The community structures that reconstituted family from the wreckage of what the auctions had destroyed. Children whose parents had been sold were raised by neighbors. Elders whose children were gone became grandparents to children not their own. The community did not ask the system's permission to love each other. It simply did. Music survived. Language survived. Not the original languages, which were systematically suppressed, but new languages, Creole languages, blended tongues that carried African structures inside European words. Religion survived, transformed, syncretized, rebuilt. The hush harbors, secret religious gatherings held deep in the woods, away from the overseer's hearing, preserved a spiritual life that the system had tried to extinguish. The songs sung in the fields carried double meanings that the overseers never decoded. Directions on the Underground Railroad hidden inside hymns. Communications between people who were not supposed to be communicating. This was not passive survival. It was active, creative, daily resistance. The construction of a human world inside a system designed to deny humanity. Resistance was not only Nat Turner's rebellion or the Underground Railroad, though both were real and both were extraordinary. Resistance was also a broken hoe, a feigned illness, a slowed pace, a seed saved from the garden and replanted in secret. A child taught to read by candlelight in a cabin with no windows, using pages torn from a Bible. Frederick Douglass, who was himself enslaved until he escaped in 1838, wrote that the moment he learned to read was the moment he understood both his slavery and the path out of it. Literacy was so understood as a threat to the system that teaching an enslaved person to read was illegal in most southern states. The law itself was an admission. A person who can read cannot be fully owned. The mind remained. The maroon communities, self-liberated people who escaped into the swamps of Jamaica, the mountains of Suriname, the forests of Brazil, built independent settlements that in some cases lasted generations, fighting off military expeditions sent to recapture them, governing themselves, maintaining African cultural practices, and proving by their existence that the system's claim of total control was a lie. They were not the exception, they were the argument. The plantation system ended through war, through resistance, through the slow and incomplete work of abolition, but it did not end cleanly. The economic structures it built, the racial hierarchies it codified into law, and the intergenerational damage it inflicted did not dissolve with emancipation. Historians, economists, and sociologists are still mapping the distance between where that system left people and where the world told them they should be able to go. What cannot be taken from the historical record is this: inside the most total system of human exploitation the modern world constructed, millions of people refused to stop being human. They named their children, they buried their dead, they fell in love, they told stories, they prayed, they sang, they taught each other to read. They could not be owned completely, and they knew it. That knowledge, passed down in the music, in the stories, in the names people chose, when they were finally allowed to choose their own names again, is the thing the system never managed to put on. The auction block, it was never for sale.